Some secrets are buried so deep that digging them up costs more than leaving them alone. The jungle humidity clung to Marcus Delacroix's skin like a second layer of guilt as he stared at the 5 white-wrapped figures arranged on the concrete outside the Medellin field station. 47 years old, 2 decades with the Bureau, and he'd never seen anything that made his hands shake quite like this. His team, Rodriguez, Chen, Harper, Williams, and young Kowalski, lay perfectly positioned in a star pattern, their faces peaceful beneath the burial cloth, golden thread glinting where their eyelids had been sewn shut with surgical precision. The security tapes told an impossible story. At 3:17 a.m., all 5 men had walked out of the building in single file, moved to their positions without hesitation, and simply lay down. No struggle, no resistance, just compliance, as if they were following orders from someone Marcus couldn't see. Marcus had built his career hunting monsters, cartel bosses, arms dealers, killers who traded in human misery. But Pablo Escobar wasn't just a drug lord. The locals whispered he was something else entirely, something that had made a bargain with the old gods who ruled these mountains long before Spanish conquistadors ever arrived. What kind of power could turn trained federal agents into willing sacrifices? And why was Marcus the only one left alive to ask that question? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus forced himself to look away from the bodies and focus on the facts. Facts were concrete. Facts didn't whisper in ancient tongues or arrange themselves in ritual patterns. He pulled out his notebook, the same leather-bound one he'd carried since Quantico, and began documenting what he could see, touch, measure. Temperature, 84 degrees Fahrenheit. Time, 5:43 a.m. Weather, clear, humid. Cause of death, unknown pending autopsy. The pen trembled in his fingers as he wrote. 20 years of crime scenes, from the crack houses of Detroit to the cartels of Miami, and his handwriting had never wavered. But Rodriguez had been his partner for 6 years. Chen was supposed to rotate back to D.C. next month to see his newborn daughter. Kowalski still owed him $50 from their poker game 3 nights ago. Agent Delacroix. Marcus turned to find Lieutenant Carlos Vega of the Colombian National Police approaching cautiously, his usual swagger replaced by something closer to reverence. The local cops had been keeping their distance since the bodies were discovered, crossing themselves and muttering prayers in rapid Spanish. "What are your men saying?" Marcus asked, closing his notebook. Vega's dark eyes flicked to the pentagram formation, then quickly away. "They say this is brujeria, witchcraft. They want to call a priest before we move the bodies. And what do you say?" "I say Pablo Escobar has many ways of sending messages. Some we understand, some—" Vega shrugged, but Marcus caught the fear beneath the gesture. "Some require different kinds of expertise." Marcus had worked with Vega for 8 months, ever since the Bureau had established this forward operating base in their hunt for Escobar. The lieutenant was practical, cynical, unimpressed by American authority. Seeing him spooked sent ice through Marcus's veins despite the tropical heat. "I need to see the security footage again." "Of course." "But Agent Delacroix," Vega caught his arm as he turned toward the building. "My grandmother was from the mountains. She knew the old stories. She always said the Muisca priests could make men walk into fire if they knew the right words. The Muisca died out centuries ago, Lieutenant." "Did they?" Vega's grip tightened. "Or did they just learn to hide better?" Inside the field station, Marcus made his way to the communications room, past walls lined with surveillance photos of cartel members and maps marking Escobar's known hideouts. The facility was a converted warehouse, all exposed concrete and harsh fluorescent lighting, a monument to American efficiency dropped into the heart of Colombian chaos. He'd called it home for 8 months, ever since his marriage to Sarah had finally cracked beyond repair, and the Bureau had offered him this assignment as an escape. The security monitor flickered to life, displaying the timestamp, 3:17:23 a.m. Marcus watched his team emerge from the building's main entrance. Rodriguez led, his expression blank, movements mechanical. The others followed in perfect single file. Chen, Harper, Williams, Kowalski. They moved like sleepwalkers, but their steps were sure, deliberate. Marcus rewound the tape, watched it again, then again. Each viewing made it worse. These weren't men under duress. They weren't being coerced. They walked like people following the most natural instructions in the world. At 3:19:45, each man reached his designated position in what would become the pentagram. They didn't look at each other, didn't speak. They simply lay down on the concrete, crossed their arms over their chests, and closed their eyes. The timestamp read 3:21 when Rodriguez, always the professional, even in death, made a small adjustment to his position, ensuring the geometric pattern was perfect. Then stillness. For 50 hours, nothing but their unmoving forms and the occasional stray dog wandering through the frame. Marcus fast-forwarded to his own return from Bogotá, where he'd been briefing headquarters on the operation. He watched himself discover the scene, saw his own face go white as he realized what he was looking at. The phone rang, jarring him back to the present. Delacroix. Marcus, it's Sarah. His ex-wife's voice carried across the static-filled line from Virginia, familiar and distant at the same time. I just saw the news report. Are you all right? He stared at the frozen image on the monitor. His team arranged like an offering to something hungry and patient. I'm fine. You don't sound fine. You sound like you did after Cartagena. Cartagena, where Marcus had watched a cartel enforcer execute 3 civilians while he hid in the shadows, gathering intelligence that ultimately saved 50 lives but cost him his sleep for 2 years running. This is different, Sarah. Is it? Or is it just another reason for you to disappear into work instead of dealing with what's in front of you? Through the window, Marcus could see Vega's men finally approaching the bodies, armed with stretchers and body bags. One officer carried a small wooden cross. Another clutched a handful of what looked like herbs. I have to go, Marcus said. Promise me you'll be careful. Whatever's happening down there. The line went dead. Colombian phone service was notoriously unreliable, but Marcus found himself staring at the receiver anyway, wondering if some conversations were meant to be cut short. Outside, the real work was about to begin. Marcus set the receiver down and remained motionless for 30 seconds, watching Vega's men through the window. They moved around the bodies like they were defusing bombs, careful, reverent, afraid. The officer with the herbs had begun sprinkling them in a wide circle around the pentagram formation. Marcus recognized the ritual from his cultural briefings, ruda andalta misa, plants the locals believed could ward off evil spirits. 3 years ago, he would have found it quaint. Now he found himself hoping they were right. The morning routine had always been Marcus's anchor. 20 years in the bureau had taught him that chaos was manageable if you could control the small things: coffee temperature, paperwork order, the precise way you cleaned your service weapon. He'd carried these habits through 3 field offices, 2 marriages, and countless crime scenes that should have broken him. But as he walked to his makeshift office, nothing felt familiar anymore. His desk sat beneath a window that normally offered a view of Medellin's sprawling favelas climbing the mountainsides like concrete ivy. Today, all he could see were the chalk outlines where his team had been found. Someone, probably Vega, had already hosed away the blood, but the geometric pattern remained, burned into the concrete like a brand. Marcus opened his laptop and began the report he'd been dreading. The Bureau would want facts, timelines, logical explanations for how 5 experienced agents had walked calmly to their deaths. He stared at the cursor blinking on the empty page, tried to find words that wouldn't get him transferred to a psychiatric evaluation. At approximately 0317 hours, subjects departed the secure facility of their own volition. He deleted the line. Started again. Preliminary investigation suggests coordinated psychological manipulation. Also deleted. The truth was he had nothing. No leads, no theories that wouldn't sound insane in a federal courtroom. Just security footage of good men acting like programmed machines and a crime scene that belonged in an anthropology textbook. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Call when you can. I mean it about being careful. Marcus stared at the message until the screen went dark. Their marriage had ended 18 months ago, officially, though it had been dying long before that. Too many missed dinners, too many phone calls cut short by emergencies only he could handle, too many nights when he'd chosen the Bureau's needs over hers. Sarah had called it emotional abandonment. Marcus had called it duty. Looking back, they'd both been right. The irony wasn't lost on him that she'd reached out now, when he was further away than ever. 3,000 miles and a dead phone line separated them, but somehow the concern in her voice had cut through static and distance like she was sitting beside him. It reminded him of the early days when she'd wait up no matter how late his cases ran, when she'd believed his work was saving the world instead of slowly consuming him. Before Cartagena, before he'd stopped sleeping through the night, before he'd started seeing the job as the only thing that made sense in an increasingly senseless world. A knock at his door interrupted the spiral of regret. Agent Patricia Reeves stepped inside, holding 2 cups of the coffee that passed for drinkable in their improvised field station. She was 34, 7 years younger than Marcus, with the kind of sharp competence that had fast-tracked her to international assignments. The Bureau had sent her down 2 weeks ago as additional support for what they'd anticipated being the final push against Escobar. Now she was the only backup he had left. "Autopsy's scheduled for this afternoon," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Bogotá's sending their best forensic team. What about the local coroner?" "Refused to touch them. Said the bodies were malditos, cursed." Reeves took a sip of coffee and grimaced. "Half the police force called in sick today. The other half are wearing enough religious medals to stock a cathedral gift shop." Marcus almost smiled. Reeves had a way of finding dark humor in the worst situations, a trait he'd once shared before Colombia had worn it out of him. "What's your read on the scene?" "Honestly, it's like nothing I've ever seen. The precision of the arrangement, the apparent cooperation of the victims." She paused, studying his face. "Marcus, I've read your file. Quantico, Miami, the Valdez takedown in '85. You've seen more cartel violence than anyone still active. What's your gut telling you?" Marcus looked out at the chalk pentagram, thought about Rodriguez adjusting his position to maintain perfect geometry even as he prepared to die. "My gut's telling me we're not dealing with a cartel. Then what are we dealing with?" Before Marcus could answer, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then steady again. Through the walls came the sound of Vega's men arguing in rapid Spanish, their voices tight with fear. "I don't know," Marcus said quietly. "But whatever it is, it's not finished with us." The argument outside escalated to shouting, then abruptly stopped. Marcus and Reeves exchanged glances before moving to the window. In the courtyard, Vega's men stood frozen around an empty stretcher, staring at something Marcus couldn't see from his angle. "What now?" Reeves muttered, already reaching for her sidearm. They found the Colombian officers clustered around the first body, Rodriguez. The white burial shroud had been pulled back to reveal his face, and one of the younger cops was pointing at Rodriguez's closed eyes with a trembling finger, speaking so rapidly Marcus could only catch fragments. "Los ojos, hilo de oro, no es posible." "What's he saying?" Marcus demanded. Vega appeared at his shoulder, his face pale. "He says the eyes, they're moving. Beneath the lids." Marcus pushed through the circle of officers and knelt beside his former partner's body. Rodriguez's face was waxy, bloodless, exactly as it had been when they'd discovered him. The golden thread that sealed his eyelids was still perfectly in place, neat surgical stitches that caught the morning light. But the kid was right. Beneath the closed lids, Rodriguez's eyes were tracking back and forth in rapid, deliberate movements. "REM sleep," Reeves said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Could be some kind of post-mortem muscle spasm." Marcus leaned closer. Rodriguez's lips, blue-tinged and slightly parted, seemed to be forming words. No sound emerged, but the shape was unmistakable. "Marcus. Marcus. Jesus Christ," one of the Colombian officers whispered, backing away. The movement stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Rodriguez's face returned to the slack, empty mask of death, leaving Marcus to wonder if he'd imagined the whole thing. But the fear in the surrounding faces told him otherwise. Vega was already barking orders in Spanish, his men eager to retreat to a safe distance. Marcus stood slowly, his knees protesting the concrete, and found himself alone beside the bodies with only Reeves for company. "We need those forensics teams here now," he said. "Already called them. They're still 6 hours out." Reeves studied the other 4 shrouded forms. "Marcus, what if this isn't about Escobar at all? What if we stumbled into something else entirely?" Before he could answer, Marcus's satellite phone chirped with an incoming message. The device was reserved for priority communications from Quantico, operational updates, emergency extractions, the kind of traffic that could change everything in seconds. The message was brief. New intelligence acquired. Operation Chrysalis compromised. Await further instructions. Do not engage target until cleared. Marcus read it twice, then handed the phone to Reeves. Operation Chrysalis was the code name for their mission to eliminate Escobar. They'd spent 8 months building the intelligence network that had finally pinpointed his location in the Comuna 13 favela. Marcus's team had been 12 hours away from the kill shot when they died. Compromised how? Reeves asked. Doesn't say. But if headquarters is pulling us back now... Another message appeared: urgent, contact control immediately. Scrambled channel only. Marcus felt the familiar weight of bureaucratic delay settling over him. Scrambled channels meant driving 20 minutes to the embassy in downtown Medellin, past roadblocks and cartel checkpoints, burning half a day on protocol while evidence degraded in the tropical heat. It meant explanations, justifications, the slow grinding machinery of federal oversight. It meant abandoning his investigation just as it was beginning. You could ignore it, Reeves said quietly. Communication problems are common down here. Another few hours of radio silence wouldn't be unusual. Marcus looked at her sharply. Suggesting insubordination wasn't like Reeves. She was ambitious, careful, the kind of agent who followed regulations like scripture. But something in her expression told him she understood what was at stake. They're my team, Patricia. They died on my watch. Which is exactly why you can't think clearly about this. Her voice softened. Whatever happened here, it's bigger than revenge. You said it yourself. We're not dealing with a cartel. So what are we dealing with? And why are your people in Washington suddenly so interested in pulling you back? The satellite phone buzzed again. This time it was a voice call, the display showing a number Marcus recognized. Deputy Director Harrison's personal line. Harrison never called field agents directly unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. Marcus stared at the ringing device, weighing 20 years of federal service against the image of Rodriguez's moving eyes and soundless lips. The smart play was obvious. Answer the call, follow orders, let someone else clean up the mess. He had pension considerations, a career to protect, a dozen rational reasons to walk away. But Rodriguez hadn't walked away when Marcus had been pinned down by sniper fire in Cartagena. None of his team had ever walked away when it mattered. The phone stopped ringing. Looks like we're having communication problems, Marcus said, switching off the device. Reeves nodded slowly. Terrible reception in these mountains. For better or worse, Marcus Delacroix had made his choice. The silence that followed felt heavier than the humid Colombian air pressing down on them. Marcus stared at the dead satellite phone in his palm, the black screen reflecting his weathered face back at him. 20 years of following orders, of trusting the system, of believing that the Bureau always knew best. And now he'd severed that lifeline with the press of a button. You realize there's no going back from this, Reeves said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harrison's going to keep calling. When he can't reach you, he'll send a team to extract us both. Marcus pocketed the phone and looked back at Rodriguez's still form. The golden thread gleamed in the morning light, but the eyes beneath remained motionless now, offering no guidance from whatever darkness had claimed them. How long do you think we have? 6 hours, maybe 8 if we're lucky. They'll assume equipment failure first, try alternate channels. But when the embassy reports we never showed up for the scheduled check-in, she left the sentence hanging. 6 hours to solve a case that defied every principle of criminal investigation Marcus had learned in 2 decades of federal service. 6 hours to understand what force had compelled 5 experienced agents to walk calmly to their deaths. 6 hours before his own career joined his team in the grave. The rational part of his mind, the part that had earned him commendations and promotions and Sarah's early admiration, screamed that he was making a catastrophic mistake. Deputy Director Harrison wasn't just his superior, he was a mentor who'd guided Marcus through the political minefields of bureau politics since the Miami days. If Harrison was pulling him back, there had to be a reason beyond bureaucratic caution. But when Marcus closed his eyes, he could still see Rodriguez's lips forming his name, could still hear Sarah's voice across the crackling phone line. You sound like you did after Cartagena. Cartagena. where he'd followed orders and watched innocents die while gathering intelligence that saved 50 other lives, where he'd learned that following the rules sometimes meant living with consequences that no regulation manual could address, where he'd started the long slide away from Sarah, away from sleep, away from any certainty about right and wrong. "There's something else," Reeves said, pulling him back to the present. She was scanning a message on her own device, local channels that might not be monitored as closely. Lieutenant Vega just received word from his contacts in Comuna 13. Escobar's compound has been empty for 3 days. No guards, no activity, no sign of the man himself. Marcus felt cold despite the climbing temperature. 3 days, right around when my team started their final surveillance. It gets worse. The locals are saying strange things have been happening in that neighborhood. People walking out of their homes in the middle of the night, heading up into the mountains. Families waking up to find relatives missing, only to have them return hours later with no memory of where they've been. The fear Marcus had been suppressing since finding the bodies crystallized into something sharper, more immediate. Whatever had taken his team wasn't finished. It was spreading, growing stronger, expanding its influence beyond the 5 men who died in perfect geometric formation. "We need to get up there," he said. "To the compound. Marcus, listen to yourself. You're talking about investigating a supernatural phenomenon like it's a drug bust. We don't have protocols for this. We don't have backup extraction plans or any idea what we're walking into." She was right, and they both knew it. The Bureau had trained them to investigate human criminals with human motivations: greed, revenge, power, ideology. Their entire framework for understanding violence relied on perpetrators who operated within the bounds of physical reality, who left evidence that could be cataloged and analyzed and presented in federal court. But golden thread didn't sew itself through dead men's eyes. Bodies didn't arrange themselves in occult formations while security cameras watched. And Marcus's 20 years of experience meant nothing when confronted with forces that predated law enforcement by millennia. His hands were shaking, he realized. The same tremor that had started after Cartagena and never quite gone away, the one Sarah had pretended not to notice during their final months together. He flexed his fingers, tried to will the weakness away, but it persisted, a reminder that some kinds of damage couldn't be compartmentalized or overcome through discipline. "What if we're not the right people for this?" he asked quietly. Reeves looked surprised. In all their months working together, she'd never heard him express doubt about a case. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if Harrison's pulling us back because he knows something we don't? What if the Bureau has people better equipped to handle this?" He gestured toward the chalk pentagram, toward the bodies that shouldn't be moving but were. "And what if Harrison's pulling us back because someone doesn't want this investigated at all?" Reeves countered. "You said it yourself, the timing is too convenient. Your team gets close to Escobar, they die under impossible circumstances, and suddenly Washington wants you gone. Maybe the question isn't whether we're the right people for this job. Maybe the question is whether we're the only people who can be trusted to do it." The satellite phone buzzed against Marcus's leg, another call from a superior who expected absolute obedience, who believed that federal authority could solve any problem if applied with sufficient force and procedure. Marcus left it ringing and walked toward Lieutenant Vega, toward the mountain roads that led to Comuna 13, toward answers that might destroy everything he thought he understood about the world. Behind him, the phone fell silent, and Patricia Reeves followed. The road to Comuna 13 carved through the mountains like a scar, switchbacking up slopes where the jungle pressed close enough to scrape the windows of Vega's battered Jeep. Marcus gripped the door handle as they rounded another hairpin turn, the vehicle's engine whining in protest against the altitude. Below them, Medellin sprawled in the valley like a concrete organism, its edges blurring into favela settlements that climbed the hillsides in defiance of gravity and government authority. "From here we walk," Vega announced, pulling off onto a dirt track barely wide enough for the vehicle. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was profound. No helicopters, no radio chatter, no familiar sounds of federal law enforcement operations. Just the whisper of wind through coca leaves and the distant echo of their own breathing. Marcus stepped out onto soil that felt different beneath his feet, foreign in a way that had nothing to do with geography. The air itself seemed thicker here, weighted with something more oppressive than humidity. Beside him, Reeves checked her sidearm with the methodical precision of someone preparing for a firefight, though they all knew bullets would be useless against whatever had claimed his team. "The compound is 2 kilometers up this trail," Vega said, shouldering a pack that clinked with emergency supplies. "My men have set a perimeter at the base of the hill. They will not go further." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "You understand they have families, children. Whatever happened to your people, it is still up there." Marcus nodded, though understanding and acceptance were different things. In any normal operation, he would have had satellite surveillance, tactical support, extraction protocols, and a command structure that could make decisions faster than he could implement them. Here, climbing toward Pablo Escobar's abandoned stronghold, with a Colombian police lieutenant, and a partner whose career he'd probably just destroyed, he felt the full weight of how far he'd strayed from everything the Bureau had taught him about proper procedure. The trail wound upward through vegetation that grew denser with each step. As if the jungle were reclaiming territory it had temporarily ceded to human ambition. Marcus found himself thinking about the security footage. Rodriguez, Thompson, Martinez, Collins, and Chen walking with such purpose, such certainty, as if they'd finally found something worth dying for. The expression on Rodriguez's face haunted him most, not fear or confusion, but something approaching peace. When had Marcus last felt peace about anything? "You know this is insane," Reeves said quietly, falling into step beside him as they climbed. "Even if we find evidence, even if we solve this thing, Harrison's going to have us both transferred to desk jobs in North Dakota. That's the best-case scenario." Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead, already feeling the altitude and humidity sapping his strength. At 47, he was older than he cared to admit, and Colombia had a way of reminding aging agents that their bodies weren't as resilient as their determination. "You didn't have to come." "Yes, I did." She paused to catch her breath, then continued with the kind of honesty that only emerged under extreme circumstances. "I've spent 7 years following every regulation, filing every report in triplicate, building a perfect career record. And you know what I realized when I saw those bodies arranged in that pentagram? All my careful planning, all my political maneuvering, none of it matters if we can't protect our own people from forces we don't understand." They climbed in silence after that, conserving breath for the steep ascent. Marcus felt something shifting inside him with each step away from the jeep, away from radio contact, away from any possibility of federal backup. It was like shedding layers of institutional armor that had protected him for 2 decades. Protocols, hierarchies, the comforting illusion that someone above his pay grade always knew what to do. Here, nobody knew what to do. Nobody had experience with golden thread and moving corpses and security footage that documented the impossible. Here, Special Agent Marcus Delacroix was just a middle-aged man with a gun and 20 years of suddenly irrelevant training, climbing toward a confrontation with something that predated everything he'd been taught to believe about justice and law enforcement. The satellite phone had been buzzing intermittently in his pocket, Harrison's increasingly urgent attempts to re-establish contact. Marcus could imagine the scene at Quantico, crisis meetings, emergency protocols, the slow escalation of concern as his silence stretched from minutes into hours. They would send a team eventually, probably within the day, and that team would find either answers or more bodies arranged in patterns that belonged in anthropology textbooks rather than criminal investigations. Above them, the trail curved toward Escobar's compound, toward whatever had transformed 5 good agents into willing sacrifices. Marcus felt Sarah's wedding ring, still on his finger after 18 months of divorce, press against his grip on the climbing rope Vega had strung between trees. Some thresholds, once crossed, changed everything that came after. Marcus had already passed the point of no return. The rope ended at a concrete wall topped with rusted razor wire, the kind of fortification that spoke of paranoia elevated to architectural principle. Vega held up a fist, signaling them to stop, then crept forward to examine what had once been the main gate to Pablo Escobar's mountain retreat. The heavy steel barrier hung open on broken hinges, swaying slightly in the thin mountain air with a sound like wind chimes made of scrap metal. "My contacts were right," Vega whispered, returning to where Marcus and Reeves crouched behind a stand of banana trees. No guards, no movement. But look at the gate, it wasn't forced. Someone opened it from the inside. Marcus studied the abandoned checkpoint through field glasses he'd borrowed from Vega's equipment pack. The guard booth stood empty, its bulletproof windows intact, its communication equipment still blinking with phantom signals. Coffee cups sat on the desk inside, their contents long since evaporated, as if the guards had simply stood up mid-conversation and walked away, just like his team had done. "We go slow," Marcus said, checking his sidearm more from habit than hope. "Stay together, document everything, and if anyone starts feeling unusual, we abort immediately." Reeves nodded, though they all understood how meaningless abort protocols were when dealing with forces that could compel experienced agents to participate in their own ritual murder. Still, the familiar cadence of operational planning provided a thin veneer of control over circumstances that had spiraled far beyond any training manual scope. They moved through the gate in tactical formation, Vega leading with his assault rifle at ready position, Reeves covering their six, Marcus scanning for threats that might not conform to standard definitions of hostile contact. The compound beyond was smaller than expected, a main house built in the architectural style of a man with unlimited resources and questionable taste, surrounded by outbuildings that had once housed Escobar's security force and communication center. Everything stood empty, not abandoned in haste, but evacuated with the methodical precision of a planned withdrawal. No scattered papers, no overturned furniture, no signs of struggle or panic. The silence was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed to sync unnaturally with the soft footsteps of his companions. "Jesus," Reeves breathed, stopping beside a swimming pool that dominated the compound's central courtyard. The pool had been drained, its blue-tiled bottom now filled with something that made Marcus's stomach lurch. Hundreds of photographs covered every surface. Surveillance shots of American agents, Colombian police officers, government officials, cartel rivals. But these weren't intelligence files or target profiles. Each photograph had been carefully arranged, overlapping to create a massive circular pattern that spiraled inward toward a single image at the center. Marcus descended the pool's ladder and walked carefully between the photographs until he could see the central picture clearly, his breath caught in his throat. It was Rodriguez, Thompson, Martinez, Collins, and Chen standing together outside the Medellin field station. The photo was recent, taken sometime in the past week, judging by the clothing and lighting. "How did they get this?" Reeves asked, joining him at the pool center. "Our operational security was perfect. No one outside the bureau knew about the team composition." Marcus knelt beside the photograph, noting details that made his hands shake with suppressed rage. The image quality was too good for a long-range surveillance shot. The angle suggested it had been taken from inside a federal vehicle. The timestamp visible in the corner indicated it was captured just hours before his team had begun their final surveillance of this very compound. "Someone told them we were coming," he said quietly. "Someone with access to our operational planning, our personnel files, our movement schedules." Vega appeared at the pool's edge, his face grim. "Agent Delacroix, you need to see this. In the main house." They climbed out of the photograph-lined pool and followed Vega across the courtyard, past empty guard positions and silent communication towers. The main house's front door stood open, revealing an interior that belonged in an architectural magazine rather than a drug lord's fortress. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, art that had probably been stolen from European museums. But it was the walls that stopped Marcus cold. Every surface had been covered with maps, photographs, and documents connected by red thread in patterns that hurt to look at directly. It was like stepping inside a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, except the connections being traced weren't random paranoia. They were targeting families, American families. Marcus approached the nearest wall, reading names and addresses that belonged to FBI agents, DEA operatives, Colombian police officers, anyone who had ever posed a threat to Escobar's organization. But beneath each photograph was something that transformed routine intelligence gathering into something far more sinister, personal details that no criminal organization should have been able to acquire. Children's school schedules, medical records, psychological profiles, information that could only have come from inside the very agencies hunting Escobar. Mother of God, Reeves whispered, finding a section dedicated to their own field station. They know everything. Our safe houses, our informants, our extraction protocols. They've been inside our operation from the beginning. Marcus felt the walls of the house pressing closer, though the dimensions hadn't changed. 20 years of federal service, of believing that the good guys and bad guys could be distinguished by badges and organizational charts, crumbled like ancient paper in his hands. His team hadn't died in some supernatural ritual. They'd been sacrificed to protect a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American law enforcement. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the distant sound of wind through broken windows. Marcus stared at the conspiracy walls until his eyes burned, trying to process the implications of what they'd discovered. 20 years of service, of believing in institutional loyalty and chain of command, lay shattered around him like broken glass. "We can't trust anyone," Reeves said, her voice hollow. "Not Harrison, not the field office, not Washington. For all we know, they're expecting us to report back so they can clean up whatever loose ends we represent." Marcus pulled out his satellite phone, thumb hovering over the speed dial for FBI headquarters. One call would bring in tactical teams, forensic specialists, the full weight of federal resources. It would also alert whoever had been feeding information to Escobar's organization that their conspiracy had been exposed. He powered down the phone instead. "What are you doing?" Reeves asked. "Buying us time. As long as Harrison thinks we're just investigating a crime scene, we have operational freedom. The moment he realizes we've uncovered this," Marcus gestured toward the walls of evidence surrounding them, "we become liabilities." Vega had been studying a section of documents written in Spanish, his face growing paler with each page. "There is something else you need to understand. These papers, they mention a man called El Santero, the shaman. He is not part of Escobar's normal organization." "Another cartel leader?" Marcus asked. "No, something older. The papers describe him as a bridge between worlds, someone who can speak to forces that existed before Columbus, before Christianity, before any European ever set foot in Colombia." Vega's hands shook as he translated. "It says here that Escobar made a pact, protection from government forces in exchange for tribute." The word hung in the air like smoke. Marcus thought of his team walking calmly to their deaths, of bodies arranged in perfect geometric patterns, of golden threads sewn through dead men's eyes with surgical precision. "Tribute," Reeves repeated. "You mean sacrifice." Before Vega could answer, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze, footsteps on the marble floors behind them, slow, deliberate, approaching from the direction they'd entered. He drew his weapon and motioned for silence, but even as they took defensive positions, he knew with terrible certainty that whatever was coming wouldn't be stopped by bullets. The footsteps stopped just outside the room where they'd taken cover behind overturned furniture. Marcus held his breath, waiting for an assault that never came. Instead, a voice drifted through the doorway, young, female, speaking accented English with the careful precision of someone who'd learned the language in expensive schools. "Agent Delacroix, there is no need for weapons. I am here to help you understand what happened to your friends." Marcus exchanged glances with Reeves. Standard protocol was to identify yourself as federal agents and demand compliance. But standard protocol had died with his team, sacrificed on the altar of forces that operated by rules written in blood and starlight rather than legal codes. "Who are you?" he called out, keeping his position behind an overturned desk. "My name is Isabella Morales. I work for Pablo Escobar, but not in the way you think. I am his insurance policy, his protection against the very forces that claimed your men." She stepped into the doorway, hands visible and empty. Marcus had expected someone older, more hardened by cartel violence. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman barely out of her 20s, dressed in clothes that belonged at a university rather than a drug lord's fortress. Her most striking feature was her eyes, dark and ancient, as if she'd seen things that aged the soul faster than time. "The men you seek to avenge chose their fate," she continued, seemingly unaware of 3 weapons trained on her center mass. "They were given the same choice Pablo was given, the same choice I was given. Serve the old powers willingly, or be consumed by them regardless. Bullshit, Reeves snapped. No one chooses to die. Isabella smiled, and the expression carried no warmth. Agent Reeves, you have spent your career believing that human will is absolute, that choice and consequence follow rational patterns. But Colombia is older than your institutions. The mountains remember gods your people never learned to fear. Marcus felt something shifting inside him, a recognition that terrified him more than any physical threat. The tremor in his hands was getting worse, spreading up his arms like a slow infection. Around him, the air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against his lungs with weight that had nothing to do with altitude. What do you want from us? He managed. The same thing Pablo wanted, the same thing your government wants: survival. Isabella stepped fully into the room, and Marcus realized that neither he nor his companions were still pointing their weapons at her. Their arms had lowered without conscious decision, muscles responding to commands that bypassed rational thought. The question, Agent Delacroix, is what you're willing to sacrifice to achieve it. Marcus tried to raise his weapon again, muscle memory screaming commands that his body refused to obey. His service pistol hung at his side like dead weight, fingers betraying 20 years of training. Behind him, he heard Reeves's sharp intake of breath, Vega's whispered prayer in Spanish, but he couldn't turn to look at them. His eyes remained locked on Isabella's face, on those ancient eyes that seemed to see straight through to the core of his terror. This is what happened to your team, Isabella said, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. The moment they entered sacred ground, the moment they pointed weapons at servants of the old powers, they ceased to belong to themselves. Free will becomes negotiable. The tremor in Marcus's hands had spread to his entire body now, not the shake of fear, but something deeper. Cellular rebellion, as if his own flesh was rejecting his attempts at control. Around him, the walls of Escobar's fortress seemed to breathe, marble and concrete pulsing with rhythms that matched no human heartbeat. Rodriguez fought the hardest, Isabella continued, circling them with predatory grace. Your team leader. He kept reaching for his radio, trying to call for extraction even as his legs carried him to the ritual site. The thread through his eyes, that was mercy. In the end, he asked for it. You're lying. The words scraped Marcus's throat raw. He thought of Rodriguez's wife, Elena, 7 months pregnant with their first child. Rodriguez had shown him ultrasound photos just 2 weeks ago, pointing out tiny fingers and toes with the wonder of a man discovering miracles. Rodriguez would never... Agent Rodriguez had a choice, Isabella interrupted. Die fighting something he couldn't understand, or accept death as service to something larger than himself. In his final moments, he chose meaning over futility. Marcus felt his deepest fear crystallizing in his chest like ice, that everything he'd built his life on, duty, honor, the pursuit of justice, was meaningless against forces that operated by rules written in blood and starlight, that his team hadn't died as heroes but as sacrificial animals. Their courage and training rendered irrelevant by powers that predated civilization itself. What do you want from us? Reeves's voice came from somewhere behind him, thick with the same paralysis that held Marcus captive. The same choice your colleagues faced. Pablo Escobar learned this truth 2 years ago when El Santero first came to him. Isabella's eyes never left Marcus as she spoke. The cartel wars, the government raids, the endless cycle of violence, all of it is theater. Performance for audiences who have forgotten that Colombia belongs to older things than human ambition. The air grew heavier, pressing against Marcus's lungs until each breath became a conscious effort. Around them, shadows lengthened despite the afternoon sun streaming through broken windows, reaching toward the 3 agents like dark fingers. He could feel something vast and patient stirring in the mountains beyond, ancient attention turning toward their small human drama with the idle curiosity of a god watching ants. Your government sent 5 teams before yours, Isabella continued. CIA, DEA, military contractors, all disappeared, all found arranged in patterns that your forensics experts filed away as unexplained phenomena. Your superiors knew you were walking into something that had consumed every previous attempt. The betrayal hit Marcus harder than any physical blow. Not just the conspiracy mapped on these walls, but the deeper truth. that he and his team had been expendable from the moment they'd accepted this assignment, sent to feed something that required American blood to maintain its protection of Escobar's empire. "They sent us to die," he whispered. "They sent you to serve," Isabella corrected. "The question is whether you'll choose conscious service or struggle uselessly against forces that have shaped this land for millennia." Marcus felt his grip on reality starting to slip, the rational world of federal procedures and criminal law dissolving like sugar in rain. Everything he'd learned at Quantico, every case he'd closed, every conviction he'd secured, all of it crumbling before the simple truth that some evils transcended human understanding. But as his mind began to fracture under the weight of cosmic insignificance, one image surfaced with startling clarity: Sarah's face on their wedding day, radiant with hope for a future they'd never quite managed to build together. He thought of the divorce papers he'd never signed, sitting in his kitchen drawer like an admission of failure he couldn't bring himself to make. If he died here, she would never know why. Just like Elena Rodriguez would never know why her husband had walked calmly to his death, why he'd chosen to sew his own eyes shut with golden thread. "No," Marcus said, the word emerging from some deep reserve of stubborn human defiance. "I won't choose. I reject the premise." Isabella's smile faltered for the first time. Around them, the breathing walls seemed to pause mid-pulse, ancient attention focusing with sudden intensity. "Agent Delacroix," she said carefully, "you don't understand the consequences of refusal. Then show me." The world exploded into agony. Marcus felt his bones trying to tear themselves apart from the inside, muscles contracting with enough force to snap tendons. His vision fractured into kaleidoscope fragments of pain and impossible geometry, walls folding through dimensions that shouldn't exist, ceiling tiles rearranging themselves into patterns that burned to perceive directly. The marble beneath his feet had become liquid, or maybe his perception of solid matter had simply ceased to function. Through the chaos, he heard Reeves screaming. Not fear, something worse. The sound of a mind breaking under pressure it was never designed to withstand. When he managed to turn his head, fighting against vertebrae that felt like they were grinding to powder, he saw her on her knees, blood streaming from her eyes and nose as she clawed at her skull. "Stop!" Marcus tried to shout, but his voice emerged as a whisper. "You're killing her!" Isabella stood unchanged amid the chaos, untouched by the supernatural storm she'd unleashed. "Agent Reeves is experiencing what your team experienced, the weight of cosmic truth delivered without preparation, without acceptance. This is what resistance looks like." Vega had collapsed completely, his body convulsing as if electricity was being fed directly into his nervous system. Foam flecked his lips, and his eyes had rolled back until only whites showed. Marcus realized with horror that the Colombian agent was dying, his brain simply shutting down rather than process whatever reality had been forced upon it. "Please," Marcus gasped, dropping to his knees as waves of impossible sensation crashed over him. He could taste colors, feel sounds as physical pressure against his skin, see the mathematical equations that governed Isabella's heartbeat floating in the air like golden script. "I'll listen. Just stop hurting them." The assault ceased instantly. Reeves collapsed forward, gasping and shaking but alive. Vega's convulsions stopped, leaving him unconscious but breathing. Marcus remained on his knees, afraid that standing would invite another demonstration of cosmic displeasure. "That was a fraction of what your team endured," Isabella said, her voice carrying new undertones that seemed to echo from somewhere deeper than her throat. "They fought for 6 hours before Rodriguez finally convinced them to submit. 6 hours of having their minds slowly expanded beyond human tolerance." Marcus wiped blood from his nose with a trembling hand. The metallic taste lingered, mixed with something else, something that reminded him of ozone and copper pennies and the smell of Sarah's hair after she'd been swimming. The juxtaposition of horror and intimate memory felt like another form of violation. "What happens if we agree?" he asked. "If we serve?" "You return to your normal lives, resume your careers. Reeves gets her promotion to assistant director that she's been seeking. Vega receives commendations that secure his family's future. You," Isabella tilted her head, studying Marcus with predatory interest, "you go home to your wife. Sign those divorce papers or don't. Choose to fight for your marriage or accept its ending. The old powers care nothing for human domestic arrangements. The offer was seductive in its simplicity. Survival without consequence, failure transformed into invisible victory. Marcus could imagine returning to Washington, filing reports that would satisfy bureaucratic requirements while omitting truths that would shatter institutional sanity. He could see himself sitting across from Elena Rodriguez, explaining that her husband had died heroically without mentioning that his heroism had consisted of choosing the manner of his own sacrifice. And Escobar? Marcus asked. Continues his work under protection that your government's weapons cannot penetrate. The drug trade flows, American cities decay, and the ancient powers receive their tributes of blood and fear. Balance is maintained. Marcus thought of the photographs in the drained swimming pool, the carefully mapped conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American law enforcement. His team had been sent to die not just to feed supernatural appetites, but to protect a criminal enterprise that existed with official blessing. The war on drugs wasn't a war at all. It was theater designed to justify the very system it claimed to combat. How many others know? He whispered. How many agents? How many officials? More than you imagine. Fewer than you fear. Isabella's smile returned, colder now. The beauty of the arrangement is that it requires so few conscious collaborators. Most participants genuinely believe they're fighting evil while serving it. Reeves stirred beside him, pushing herself up on shaking arms. When she looked at Marcus, her eyes held the glassy distance of severe trauma. "Marcus," she whispered, "I can't. My head is—" "The first contact is always difficult," Isabella said with clinical detachment. Agent Reeves's mind is attempting to reconcile 20 years of law enforcement training with the knowledge that law itself is a human fiction. The cognitive dissonance will resolve once she accepts her new role. Marcus felt the last of his resistance crumbling like sand between his fingers. Everything he'd believed about justice, about the fundamental difference between right and wrong, had been revealed as elaborate self-deception. His team was dead. His marriage was over. His career had been built on lies sophisticated enough to fool even their believers. And somewhere in the mountains beyond Medellin, ancient things that had never known human names waited patiently for their newest servants to stop pretending they had any choice in the matter.